You notice it first not as a decision, but as a sensation, a slight delay where your body used to move automatically, a pause before you respond to a familiar emotional pull. Someone in your family is distressed, irritated, disappointed, or vaguely unsettled. And for most of your life, something in you would have already leaned forward to receive it. You would have adjusted your tone, softened your position, prepared an explanation, offered reassurance, absorbed the mood. Now there is a fraction of a second where none of that happens. The space appears before the habit. It is small, almost imperceptible, but it is enough to change everything. That pause is not neutrality. It is not distance. It is not indifference. It is the moment where you do not immediately step into the role that once guaranteed belonging. And because this role was never named, because it was never consciously agreed upon, its absence feels to others like something has been taken away. You have not declared independence. You have not announced a boundary. You have simply stopped translating their inner state into your own responsibility. The result is a subtle destabilization in the emotional field around you. Conversations feel slightly off. Silences stretch longer than they used to. Someone looks at you as if waiting for a line you have forgotten to deliver. What you experience internally does not feel like relief. It feels closer to unease. There is a quiet tension, a sense that something important has been left undone, not because there is an actual task remaining, but because the psyche has been conditioned to associate your worth with emotional responsiveness. When you do not respond in the familiar way, an old alarm stirs. The alarm does not say you are doing something wrong in moral terms. It says you are risking something essential. Love, safety, inclusion. This is why healing at this stage feels less like growth and more like betrayal. The word betrayal carries weight because it points to an implicit contract. You were never told the terms out loud, but you learned them through repetition. In your early environment, emotional stability did not circulate freely. It moved along specific channels. You learned where tension accumulated and where it was released. You learned who could express need and who could not. You learned which feelings were welcomed and which created discomfort. And very early, before you had language for it, you discovered that your attention, your sensitivity, your willingness to accommodate could regulate the atmosphere. When you adjusted yourself, things became calmer. When you did not, something tightened in the room. This is how the unconscious bargain formed, not as a thought, but as a lived equation. If you carry what others cannot, the system holds. If you absorb what is unspoken, connection remains intact. The bargain was not experienced as sacrifice at first. It was experienced as usefulness, as being needed, as having a place for a child. This is indistinguishable from love. You were not choosing self-erasure. You were choosing continuity. The psyche does not register this as pathology. It registers it as adaptation. Later, When you begin to withdraw from this function, the system reacts as all systems do when a load-bearing element shifts. There is confusion, irritation, sometimes accusation, not necessarily spoken, but felt. A parent sighs more heavily when you do not reassure them. A sibling becomes sharper when you do not mediate. A familiar emotional script fails to activate, and the failure is experienced not as your growth, but as your refusal. From their perspective, something that kept the structure stable is no longer available. From your perspective, you have simply stopped overextending yourself. The discrepancy between these perceptions is where the feeling of betrayal arises. The father complex lives here, not as an abstract idea, but as a bodily memory. If your father was emotionally absent, overwhelmed, rigid, or silently demanding, you may have learned to orient yourself around his moods. You became alert to shifts in tone, to moments of withdrawal, to unspoken expectations. Your sensitivity did not develop randomly. It developed in response to an environment where emotional attunement served as a form of safety. You learned when to speak and when not to, when to soften and when to disappear. Over time, this orientation toward the father's inner state became internalized. Even when he was no longer present, the pattern remained. The mother complex operates differently but reaches the same result. If your mother relied on you emotionally, leaned on you for understanding, or subtly positioned you as a source of comfort, you may have learned that separation caused pain. Her distress may not have been dramatic, but it was enough: a sigh, a look, a withdrawal of warmth. You learned that your autonomy unsettled her, that your independence created anxiety. And so you learned to remain close, to remain responsive, to remain available. This too did not feel like sacrifice. It felt like care. It felt like being good. It felt like love. When you begin to heal, you are not dismantling these complexes intellectually. You are interrupting their expression in daily life. You answer a message later than usual. You do not fill the silence. You do not explain your mood. You do not preemptively soothe. Each of these moments is small, ordinary, almost trivial, but together they withdraw energy from patterns that have relied on your participation for decades. The psyche of the family system feels this immediately, even if no one can articulate it. The disturbance is registered as a loss, and loss seeks a cause. Projection enters at this point, not as hostility, but as confusion. Others begin to sense something unfamiliar in you, a density, a slowness. You are not sharper or colder, but you are less permeable, because they cannot locate this change within themselves. They locate it in you. You are becoming distant. You are withholding. You are changing. These are not accusations in the moral sense. They are attempts to restore a familiar configuration. If the change can be attributed to you, then perhaps it can be corrected. What is being projected is not malice, it is dependency. The shadow aspect of those around you contains the parts of themselves they never had to carry because you carried them instead. Their anxiety, their indecision, their unprocessed grief, their need for reassurance. As long as you were available to receive these elements, they did not have to encounter them directly. When you stop absorbing what is not yours, these contents return to their rightful owners. This return is rarely welcomed. It feels abrupt, even if it is long overdue. You may notice this in a simple exchange. A family member complains about a familiar problem in the past. You would have listened closely, mirrored their feelings, offered perspective. Now you listen. But something does not move forward. You do not add emotional momentum. The conversation ends awkwardly. Later, you feel a vague guilt, as if you have failed a test you have passed 100 times before. The guilt does not arise because you did harm. It arises because the old reward is missing. The reward was not praise, it was relief, it was the easing of tension, it was the sense that you had secured your place. Repetition compulsion keeps drawing you back into these moments, not because you enjoy them, but because they confirm an identity. Each time you overextend, each time you betray your own limits, you receive a familiar signal: you are needed. The psyche, especially when shaped early by conditional belonging, confuses being needed with being safe. The compulsion is not toward suffering. It is toward coherence. Even a painful pattern feels coherent if it is known. As you begin to step out of this repetition, the psyche resists, not because the new position is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar. The absence of immediate emotional exchange creates a strange stillness. You may feel empty, unanchored, unsure of who you are, without the constant feedback loop. This is not a sign of regression. It is the consequence of withdrawing energy from roles that once organized your sense of self. The quiet that follows is not peace yet. It is an interim state where old structures have loosened and new ones have not fully formed. In this phase, power does not announce itself. It rearranges itself. When you no longer absorb what is not yours, your energy stops leaking into the environment. It does not surge outward, it settles inward. This settling can feel like heaviness at first, not depression, but weight. You are no longer floating on responsiveness. You are inhabiting your own center of gravity. To others, this can feel like absence. To you, it feels like standing still after a lifetime of compensating movement. You might notice that interactions slow down. People speak differently to you. Some test the old entry points, offering emotion in the familiar way, waiting to see if you will receive it. When you do not, they may repeat themselves, intensify, or withdraw. None of this is calculated. It is the system probing for stability. You are not obligated to correct this. In fact, any attempt to explain yourself too early pulls you back into the old position of translator and regulator. The sense of betrayal intensifies here because you are no longer performing the invisible labor that kept discomfort at bay. You are not punishing anyone. You are not teaching a lesson. You are simply no longer intercepting what was never yours to carry. But from the perspective of those who benefited unconsciously from your self-erasure, the change feels personal. They may experience grief without knowing why. They may experience irritation without a clear object. They may experience fear that something essential is slipping away. Inside you, another process unfolds. Without the constant outward orientation, your own unprocessed material begins to surface. Feelings you did not have space to feel before make themselves known, not dramatically, but persistently, a tiredness that cannot be solved by rest, a sense of having lived sideways, a quiet anger that does not seek expression, only acknowledgement. This is the shadow you postponed in order to manage everyone else's. Now that you are no longer occupied with absorption, it steps forward, not to overwhelm you, but to be recognized. The temptation at this point is to rush toward clarity, to name what is happening, to justify the shift, to restore balance through explanation. This temptation is strongest when you sense discomfort in others. The old reflex whispers that harmony can be regained if you just say the right thing. But something in you hesitates, not out of defiance, but out of fatigue. The explanations no longer feel true. They feel like performances. You begin to sense that speaking too soon would collapse the pause that made this shift possible in the first place. This hesitation is fragile. It does not yet have confidence. It is easily shaken by guilt, by nostalgia, by the memory of how things used to feel when everyone was comfortable. You may find yourself hovering at the edge of old behaviors, halfway in, halfway out. You respond. Then pull back. You offer, then retract. This inconsistency is not a failure. It is the psyche recalibrating under new conditions. As this recalibration continues, you may notice moments of unexpected stillness. An evening with no messages to answer, a conversation that ends without resolution, a family gathering where you are present but not performing. These moments can feel strangely empty, as if something is missing. What is missing is the constant confirmation of your role. Without it, you are left with yourself, unbuffered. The mind searches for orientation. The body feels exposed. This is the quiet phase where authority has not yet stabilized, and the absence of the old function has not yet been replaced by a new internal structure. In this space, the complexes do not disappear. They reorganize. The father complex no longer dictates vigilance, but it still lingers as an expectation of consequence. The mother complex no longer demands fusion, but it still whispers about loss. Projection continues, but it loses some of its grip as you no longer respond automatically. Repetition, compulsion weakens, but it does not vanish. It waits for moments of vulnerability, moments when loneliness or doubt make the old bargain seem tempting again. You may find yourself standing in a familiar room, listening to a familiar voice, and feeling an unfamiliar restraint in your own body. Words rise, then stop, an explanation forms, then dissolves. There is no drama in this, no internal speech declaring change. Just a growing sense that stepping back into the old pattern would require a kind of violence against yourself that you are no longer willing to commit. Even though you cannot yet fully articulate why, and even though the cost of not committing it is still unclear, still unsettled, still unfolding as you remain in the pause, sensing the weight of what is no longer moving through you and what has not yet learned how to stand on its own. The pause you are holding does not yet feel like a position. It feels provisional, as if it could collapse at any moment. You are still close enough to the old patterns to feel their gravitational pull. When a familiar emotional signal appears, your nervous system reacts before your mind does. There is a flicker of readiness, a half-formed movement toward accommodation. What stops you now is not discipline or resolve, but a growing incongruence. The gesture feels false before it is completed. The words feel borrowed. You sense in the body that stepping forward would require you to leave yourself behind. This sensation is new enough that it does not yet have language. You cannot easily describe it to others. And when you try to describe it to yourself, it slips away. This is part of why the urge to explain remains so strong. Explanation has always been the bridge back to safety. If others understand you, perhaps the discomfort will ease. If they understand you, perhaps they will not feel abandoned. But what you are encountering now is that understanding does not restore the old equilibrium, even when you speak carefully, even when you are precise and gentle. The underlying disturbance remains. The system is not reacting to a lack of information. It is reacting to a loss of function. You begin to see this in the subtle ways people respond when you no longer absorb what they bring. A parent speaks at length about their worry, then pauses, waiting. The pause stretches. In the past, you would have stepped in, not to solve the problem, but to relieve the tension of its being spoken. Now you remain silent, not pointedly, not defensively, but because nothing in you moves forward. The silence feels heavier than words ever did. The other person shifts, grows uneasy, perhaps irritated. They may speak again, repeating themselves with more intensity, as if volume could substitute for reception. When you still do not take it in, something changes in their tone. The interaction ends without resolution, and you carry the residue of it long after. What you carry is not guilt in the simple sense. It is the echo of an old identity being questioned. If you are not the one who holds this, then who are you? And if you do not hold this, what happens to the relationship that formed around that holding? These questions do not arise consciously at first. They appear as bodily discomfort, as restlessness, as a vague sense of having violated an unspoken rule. The rule was never articulated, but it was enforced through affect. When you complied, warmth flowed. When you did not, something cooled. The father complex reveals itself here as an internalized authority that measures your legitimacy by your usefulness. Even if your father was not overtly demanding, his emotional economy taught you something about value. Perhaps his approval was rare, inconsistent, or conditional. Perhaps his withdrawal was silent but absolute. You learned to anticipate it, to work around it, to prevent it by adjusting yourself over time. This adjustment became automatic. You did not experience it as fear. You experienced it as competence. You knew how to keep things from falling apart. Now, when you no longer perform this competence, the internalized father reacts not with words, but with a sense of impending consequence. Something bad will happen if you do not step in. Someone will be disappointed. Something will break. This sense is not rooted in the present moment. It is rooted in an earlier time when withdrawal of approval meant danger. The psyche does not easily distinguish between then and now. It responds to familiar signals with familiar defenses. The mother complex, meanwhile, activates a different anxiety. If your mother leaned on you emotionally or subtly required your presence to feel stable, your withdrawal now touches an old fear, that separation causes harm. When you do not respond, you may imagine her distress growing, even if she has not expressed it. You may feel responsible for her discomfort, as if your individuation were an act of aggression. This is not because you believe you are harming her, but because your psyche learned early that her emotional equilibrium depended, in part, on your availability. These complexes do not announce themselves as such. They speak through sensation, tightness in the chest, a pull in the stomach, a sudden urge to make contact, the temptation to check in, to smooth over, to reassure. When you resist this temptation, even quietly, the anxiety does not immediately resolve. It lingers, searching for a discharge. This is where projection from others intensifies. They feel something unsettled and look to you as its cause. You feel something unsettled and look inward for justification. The loop tightens. You may notice that people begin to narrate your change for you. They say you are distant, preoccupied, different. These descriptions are not always hostile. Often they are attempts to restore familiarity. If your change can be named, perhaps it can be reversed. If it can be framed as a mood, a phase, a problem, then perhaps the old role will return. You may feel an impulse to correct them, to clarify that nothing is wrong, that you still care. But each clarification pulls you back into the position of emotional regulator. You become responsible not only for your own state, but for their interpretation of it. Shadow attachment becomes visible here. The parts of others that were never fully developed because you compensated for them now press forward. Their anxiety seeks a container. Their frustration seeks a target. Their uncertainty seeks reassurance. When you no longer provide these, the shadow does not disappear. It becomes restless. And because the psyche prefers projection to ownership, These restless elements are attributed to you. You are the one who is withholding. You are the one who has changed. You are the one causing discomfort. In the past, repetition, compulsion ensured that you would respond to this pressure by stepping back into the role. The reward was immediate. Tension eased. Connection resumed. You felt useful again. Now, as the compulsion weakens, you are left without that reward. The system no longer stabilizes through your self-erasure. Instead, instability lingers. This lingering can feel intolerable. You may catch yourself longing for the old exhaustion, simply because it was familiar. The psyche often prefers known suffering to unknown neutrality. During this phase, you may oscillate. There are moments when you hold the boundary effortlessly, almost without noticing. And there are moments when you collapse back into old habits, offering explanations, reassurance, emotional labor. When this happens, the relief is brief. The old fatigue returns quickly, heavier than before. This is not punishment, it is information. The psyche is learning through contrast what no longer fits. The quiet phase deepens. Without the constant outward flow of attention, your inner world becomes more audible. Thoughts that were once drowned out by relational noise now surface. You may notice how often you oriented yourself around others' needs without being asked. You may see patterns that were invisible when you were inside them. This seeing is not analytical, it is experiential. You feel the cost of what you gave, not in dramatic suffering, but in a steady depletion that you once mistook for normality. At the same time, the absence of constant engagement can feel empty. You may find yourself with unstructured time that feels strangely unsettling. Even rest does not immediately soothe. The body is accustomed to vigilance. When vigilance drops, there is a lag before calm arrives. In this lag, doubt thrives. You may wonder if you are becoming selfish, if you are losing something essential, if the price of this withdrawal will be isolation. This doubt is intensified by the reactions of others. Some may pull away when you no longer perform. The relationship thins, contact decreases. This thinning can feel like confirmation of your fear that without self-erasure, connection dissolves. But what is dissolving is not connection itself. It is a specific configuration of connection, one that depended on imbalance. The psyche, however, does not register this distinction immediately. It registers loss. You may also encounter subtle attempts to draw you back in, requests framed as emergencies, emotional disclosures timed for moments when you are tired, appeals to shared history. None of this is necessarily manipulative in a conscious sense. It is the system seeking to restore equilibrium. When you do not respond as expected, the attempts may escalate or shift form. The testing is not about cruelty, it is about adaptation. Internally, another shift is underway. As you stop absorbing what is not yours, your own emotional weight begins to consolidate. You are no longer dispersing it outward. This consolidation can feel like heaviness, but it is a different kind of heaviness than before. It has edges, it has shape. You are becoming more opaque to others and more solid to yourself. This solidity does not yet feel like authority. It feels like density. You may notice that your speech changes. You speak less, not because you are withholding, but because fewer words feel necessary. When you do speak, your words land differently. There is less modulation, less anticipation of response. This can unsettle others who were accustomed to your attunement. They may misread this as withdrawal of care. You may feel tempted to compensate by explaining, by softening, by reassuring, but each time you resist, something stabilizes a little more inside you. This stabilization is slow. It does not produce clarity all at once. It produces a series of small recognitions. You begin to see how often your presence was used as a buffer against discomfort. You see how rarely others were asked to sit with their own emotions without intervention. You see how your sensitivity was conscripted into service long before you had a choice. These recognitions are not accusations. They are observations, and observation, when sustained, changes structure. As this structure changes, you may feel caught between two worlds. The old world, where your role was clear but costly, and the emerging world, where your role is unclear but more truthful. In this in-between space, there is no script. Interactions feel improvisational. You cannot rely on habit. You must sense your way forward moment by moment. This requires a different kind of attention, one that is inwardly anchored rather than outwardly reactive. The anxiety that accompanies this shift does not always announce itself as fear. Sometimes it appears as boredom, as restlessness, as a vague dissatisfaction. The psyche, deprived of its usual stimulation, searches for movement. It may tempt you back into old dynamics simply to feel something familiar. You may notice yourself reaching out without clear reason, checking in when nothing is wrong, offering help that was not requested. When you catch yourself doing this, you may feel a quiet disappointment, not because you failed, but because you see how automatic the impulse still is. The repetition compulsion loosens not through force, but through awareness. Each time you notice the impulse without acting on it, the circuit weakens slightly. Each time you act on it and feel the old exhaustion return, the psyche learns through contrast. This learning is not linear. It moves in spirals. You revisit the same dynamics, but from a slightly altered position each time. Others continue to project. They may attribute motives to you that do not belong to you. They may assume you are angry, detached, superior. These assumptions can sting, especially when they come from those you once protected. The urge to correct them remains strong, but you begin to sense that correction would not resolve the underlying tension. The tension does not arise from misunderstanding. It arises from redistribution of emotional labor. As you sit with this, something subtle happens. The feeling of betrayal shifts. It becomes less acute, less personalized. You begin to see that what feels like betrayal to others is, in fact, the withdrawal of an unconscious service. You are not betraying a person, you are betraying a pattern, and patterns, when they are deprived of energy, do not negotiate, they destabilize. This destabilization is not yet complete. The system has not fully reorganized. You are still in the phase where things feel suspended. Old supports have loosened, but new ones have not fully formed. You may feel exposed, as if you are standing without armor. The armor was never protection. It was adaptation. Without it, you feel the rawness of being present without function. In this rawness, you may become acutely aware of moments when you are seen not for what you provide, but for what you are. These moments are rare at first. They may come from unexpected places. A brief exchange where no one needs anything from you. A shared silence that does not demand explanation. These moments do not excite you. They steady you, but they are fleeting, and you may not trust them yet. Trust is difficult because the psyche is still scanning for threat. The father complex still expects consequence. The mother complex still fears loss. Projection still circles. Repetition still tugs, and yet, beneath all of this, something is aligning, not dramatically, not triumphantly, but incrementally. Your center of gravity is shifting inward. You are becoming less available to be moved by others' unmet needs. This does not make you rigid. It makes you slower to be commandeered. As this slowness takes hold, you may find yourself in conversations where you no longer know how to respond. Not because you are confused, but because the old responses no longer fit and new ones have not yet emerged. You may say less. You may let silences stand. You may feel awkward. This awkwardness is not social ineptitude. It is the psyche recalibrating its relational posture. The sense of emptiness that accompanies this recalibration can be unsettling. You may wonder if you have lost something essential. You may grieve the intensity of the old bonds, even as you recognize their cost. This grief does not seek consolation. It seeks acknowledgement. It is the grief of releasing an identity that was built around being needed. As you remain in this space, resisting the urge to fill it prematurely, resisting the urge to explain it away, something continues to work itself out beneath the surface. The complexes loosen their grip, not because they are defeated, but because the conditions that sustained them are changing. Projection loses some of its force when it no longer finds immediate confirmation. Repetition weakens when the reward no longer satisfies. You are still in the middle of this process. Nothing is resolved. The quiet has not yet clarified itself into authority. The weight you feel has not yet settled into alignment. You are standing in the unsettled space where the old bargain no longer holds. But the new structure has not yet fully taken shape, and you continue to move through ordinary moments with an unfamiliar restraint, sensing that something fundamental is reorganizing itself within you, even as the external world presses for a return to what was familiar. And you remain suspended between the impulse to comply and the growing impossibility of doing so without betraying something inside that has only just begun to register its own gravity. As the suspension continues, you begin to notice that the pressure to return to the old configuration does not come only from others. It comes from within you as well, often wearing the voice of reason. It asks practical questions. Is this necessary? Is this kind? Is this really what you want? The questions sound balanced, thoughtful, even mature, but beneath them is an older fear that if you do not resume your former position, you will lose coherence. That without the familiar role, you will not know how to orient yourself in relation to others. This fear does not arise because you are incapable of relating differently. It arises because your identity was organized around a particular exchange. You gave emotional labor, attunement, absorption, and in return, you received a sense of place, not overt appreciation, not necessarily warmth, but predictability. The psyche values predictability more than comfort. When predictability dissolves, anxiety fills the gap. Even if what is emerging is healthier, you may notice that your internal dialogue becomes quieter but more charged. There is less chatter, fewer rehearsals of conversation, fewer anticipatory explanations. Instead, there is a low-grade alertness, as if you are listening for something. This listening is not outward, it is inward. You are waiting to see what moves you now, in the absence of obligation. This waiting can feel uncomfortable, even disorienting. You were accustomed to responding. Initiating from within feels unfamiliar. In interactions with family, this unfamiliarity becomes pronounced. Someone asks a question that once would have activated a cascade of responses. Now you pause. You consider whether the question actually belongs to you, not intellectually, but somatically. Does something in you move toward it? Or does it remain still? Increasingly, you trust this stillness. You answer more selectively. You leave some things unanswered. The effect is subtle but cumulative. You are no longer automatically available. This shift exposes the structure of projection more clearly. When you were available, others could deposit their unease into you without noticing. Your receptivity made the exchange invisible. Now that the receptivity has limits, the exchange becomes apparent. Their discomfort lingers with them. They may become restless, irritable, or withdrawn. They may attempt to re-engage you through emotional cues that once worked effortlessly. When these cues no longer elicit the same response, confusion sets in. Confusion often seeks narrative. People may begin to tell stories about why you are different. You are stressed, you are distracted, you are influenced by something or someone. These stories are not about accuracy. They are about restoring a sense of order if the change can be explained externally. Then the internal disruption does not have to be confronted. You may hear these narratives indirectly. or sense them in tone and behavior. They may hurt not because they are hostile, but because they reveal how little your inner reality was ever part of the relational equation. Inside you, another recognition forms. You begin to see how often your sensitivity was mistaken for consent, because you noticed everything. It was assumed you could carry everything because you rarely objected. It was assumed you were fine. The absence of protest was taken as agreement. Now that you are no longer silently agreeing, the assumptions falter. This faltering can feel like rejection to those who relied on you. To you, it feels like the first honest accounting of what was actually happening. The repetition compulsion surfaces again, but in a subtler form. It does not only draw you back into old dynamics, it also tempts you to recreate them internally. You may replay interactions in your mind, imagining how you could have handled them differently, how you could have softened the impact, how you could have prevented discomfort. These mental rehearsals serve the same function as the old behaviors. They attempt to restore control by reabsorbing responsibility. When you notice this, you may feel tired, not physically, but psychically. The mind is working to maintain a pattern that no longer fits. As you resist this internal repetition, something begins to change in your relationship to guilt. Guilt becomes less sharp, less commanding. It no longer immediately dictates action. Instead, it appears as a signal that can be observed. You notice when guilt arises without an accompanying sense of wrongdoing. You see that much of what you labeled as guilt was actually anxiety about breaking an unconscious agreement. When the agreement loses its authority, the guilt loses its urgency. This does not mean guilt disappears. It means it becomes more discriminating. You begin to distinguish between guilt that arises from having violated your own values and guilt that arises from having disrupted someone else's expectations. This distinction is not conceptual at first. It is felt. One kind of guilt feels heavy and clarifying. The other feels diffuse and draining. Over time, you learn to tell them apart without analysis. The father complex loosens further here. The internalized sense of consequence begins to weaken as you observe that nothing catastrophic happens when you do not intervene. The feared collapse does not occur. Relationships may change, but they do not implode in the way the early psyche anticipated. This observation is slow to register, but it accumulates. Each non-event chips away at the old authority. You begin to trust your own perception of what is actually happening, rather than the inherited expectation of disaster. The mother complex, too, begins to shift. You notice that others survive your non-responsiveness. Their discomfort does not destroy them. They adapt, or they do not. But either way, the world continues. This realization can be surprisingly painful. It confronts you with how much responsibility you assumed unnecessarily. It also confronts you with the limits of your influence. You were never as essential as the complex suggested. This is not diminishing. It is relieving, though the relief is mixed with grief. Grief emerges here in a quiet form. You grieve the time and energy spent maintaining balance that was never yours to maintain. You grieve the version of yourself that believed love required constant self-adjustment. You grieve the intensity of bonds that were built on asymmetry. This grief does not ask for expression. It settles into you, adding weight. The weight does not crush you. It grounds you. As this grounding deepens, your sense of power begins to change, not outwardly, not in behavior, but internally. Power no longer feels like the ability to manage outcomes. It feels like the ability to remain where you are without being pulled into movement that betrays your own center. This power is quiet and easily overlooked. It does not impress. It stabilizes. You may notice that some relationships recalibrate in response to this stabilization. Without the old dynamic, they either thin out or find a new equilibrium. Conversations become simpler, less charged. There is less emotional exchange, but also less exhaustion. You may feel a pang of loss for what was intense, even as you appreciate what is calmer. Other relationships may drift away entirely. This drift can feel like confirmation of your deepest fear, that without self-erasure, connection fades. But what fades is not genuine contact, it is dependency. During this period, the sense of emptiness you felt earlier begins to change quality. It becomes less anxious, more neutral. You may find moments of stillness that no longer feel like waiting for something to happen. They simply are. In these moments, you are not performing, not anticipating, not absorbing. You are present without function. This presence can feel strange, almost unreal, because it is so different from what you knew. But it is also restful in a way that does not require recovery. You may catch glimpses of yourself in this new posture, perhaps in a conversation where you listen without taking responsibility, perhaps in a family setting where you observe dynamics without entering them, perhaps alone, noticing that your thoughts are fewer and more anchored. These glimpses do not yet form a coherent identity. They are fragments, but they point towards something stabilizing beneath the surface. Projection continues, but it loses its urgency. When others attribute motives to you, you feel less compelled to correct them, not because you are indifferent, but because you sense that correction would re-entangle you. Their interpretations belong to them. This realization is not defensive, it is factual. You begin to see how often you once took responsibility for others' inner narratives. Releasing this responsibility creates space, though the space can feel stark at first. Repetition compulsion makes one more attempt here, often through nostalgia. You may remember moments of closeness, of shared intensity, of being the one who understood. These memories can be seductive. They highlight what was meaningful and obscure what was costly. When you linger in them, you may feel an urge to reach out, to restore the old closeness. If you do, you may find that the closeness no longer feels the same. Something in you resists fully re-entering. The pattern does not lock in as it once did. This resistance is not willful. It is structural. As structure changes, so does your sense of time. Urgency decreases. You feel less pressure to resolve things quickly. You can tolerate ambiguity longer. This tolerance is not passive. It is grounded. You are no longer driven to immediate action by the discomfort of others. You can let situations unfold. This is unsettling to those who relied on your responsiveness, but it is essential for your own integration. The quiet phase persists. There is still no dramatic clarity, no declaration of selfhood, but there is a growing sense that you are no longer in free fall. The weight you felt earlier has found some purchase. You are standing more firmly in your own psychic space. The complexes are still present, but they are no longer steering unchallenged. Projection still occurs, but it does not determine your movement. Repetition still beckons, but it does not compel. You may not yet feel internally sovereign. That comes later, but you feel less internally divided. The split between what you feel and what you do narrows. When you say no, it is quieter, less defended. When you say yes, it is more deliberate. You begin to sense the difference between response and reaction. This difference is subtle, but it reorganizes everything. In this state, healing still feels like betrayal at times, especially when the old emotional signals notice your absence. But the feeling is less consuming. It no longer defines you. It passes through, leaving behind information rather than obligation. You are learning slowly and without ceremony that not every discomfort requires your intervention, that not every bond survives individuation, and that the authority emerging within you is not a posture you adopt, but a weight you gradually learn to carry as you remain in ordinary moments without translating yourself into usefulness, without rushing to explain the stillness that has begun to organize itself around you, even as the final shape of that organization has not yet fully revealed itself. There comes a point where the suspension no longer feels provisional, not because everything has been resolved, but because something inside you has stopped scanning for permission to exist. The shift is quiet. It does not announce itself as confidence. It feels more like a settled gravity. You are still aware of others' emotional states, but they no longer reorganize you. You can register distress without translating it into duty. You can witness disappointment without absorbing it as evidence of failure. This capacity does not come from detachment. It comes from differentiation. Differentiation is not distance. It is the recognition that what arises in another does not automatically belong to you. When this recognition stabilizes, the feeling of betrayal changes its meaning. It no longer feels like you are harming someone by stepping back. It feels like you are finally standing in the place that was always yours, a place you vacated early in order to maintain connection. The discomfort others experience is no longer interpreted as damage you caused. It is seen as the natural consequence of a system adjusting to a new distribution of weight. You begin to understand, not intellectually but structurally, that love and self-betrayal were once fused in your experience. They were paired so early and so consistently that separating them now feels unnatural at first. Healing disrupts this fusion. It reveals that what you once called love often depended on your willingness to disappear. This recognition does not turn you against your family. It turns you toward accuracy. You see more clearly what was asked of you, what you provided, and what it cost. The father complex settles into a different form here. Authority is no longer experienced as something outside you that must be appeased or anticipated. It is internalized as an alignment between perception and action. You trust your reading of a situation. You do not override it reflexively. The old fear of consequence loses its charge because you have observed repeatedly that your non-intervention does not produce the collapse once imagined. Authority becomes quiet confidence in your own assessment, not a posture of dominance. The mother complex, too, finds a new orientation. Care is no longer synonymous with fusion. You can feel concern without merging. You can be present without becoming responsible. The fear that separation causes harm dissolves into a more grounded understanding that each psyche must carry its own emotional weather. You are no longer the climate control for the family system. This does not make you uncaring. It makes your care more honest. Projection still occurs, but it no longer lands with the same force. When others attribute motives or meanings to your behavior, you can sense the projection without needing to counter it. You do not correct their inner narratives because you no longer experience them as obligations. Their interpretations are understood as responses to their own discomfort, not accurate reflections of your intent. This understanding creates a buffer that does not require defense. Repetition compulsion loosens decisively at this stage. The old reward for self-betrayal no longer satisfies. When you consider stepping back into the familiar role, the cost is immediately apparent. The fatigue returns in anticipation, not after the fact. The psyche has learned the pattern does not vanish, but it loses its seduction. You can see it for what it is, an outdated strategy for belonging that no longer corresponds to who you are becoming. Power now is experienced as stability. You do not feel compelled to manage outcomes or regulate emotional atmospheres. You can tolerate misunderstanding without rushing to clarify. You can allow relationships to shift without chasing their previous form. This tolerance is not resignation. It is grounded presence. You are no longer animated by the need to be seen in a particular way. You are oriented toward internal coherence rather than external approval. The quiet phase resolves not into excitement, but into clarity. Life may still feel simple, even sparse, but it no longer feels empty. The stillness has weight. You occupy your own space without apology. When you speak, it is because something in you moves forward naturally, not because silence feels dangerous. When you remain silent, it is because nothing needs to be added. This silence is not withholding, it is appropriate containment. In ordinary moments, the difference is palpable. A family member expresses distress, and you listen without preparing a response. The moment passes. You do not replay it later. You do not carry it with you. Another person is disappointed in a way that once would have undone you. You notice the feeling, acknowledge it internally, and continue with your day. These moments do not feel dramatic, they feel correct. You are no longer confused about the difference between love and self-betrayal. Love allows separation. It does not require constant proof. It does not demand your disappearance. Self-betrayal, by contrast, now feels immediately discordant. Your body registers it as misalignment. You do not need to analyze this sensation, you trust it. There is also a noticeable absence. The urge to explain yourself has faded, not because you are closed, but because explanation no longer serves a stabilizing function. You do not need to justify your internal position. It is no longer provisional. You are not waiting for agreement. You are not seeking permission. You are simply inhabiting your own psychic territory. This does not make relationships effortless. Some bonds remain altered. Some never return to their previous intensity. You may feel a quiet sadness about this, but it does not pull you back. You understand now that intensity was often a function of imbalance. What remains, or what emerges, may be less dramatic, but it is more reciprocal. You can meet others as yourself, not as a role. The authority that has stabilized within you is not performative. It does not require recognition. It expresses itself through consistency. You are predictable in a new way, not because you are accommodating, but because you are aligned. Others sense this alignment, even if they do not name it. Some respond with respect, others withdraw. Neither response determines your posture. Healing no longer feels like betrayal because you are no longer measuring yourself against an unconscious contract. You see that the contract was never mutual. It was adaptive, forged in conditions that required it, and now obsolete. Releasing it does not require anger or justification. It requires clarity. You stand now in that clarity, not elevated, not triumphant, but upright. Your inner authority does not push outward. It holds. You are weighted, bounded, and internally aligned. You know what belongs to you and what does not. You do not need to announce this knowledge. It organizes your presence quietly, steadily, in the way you move through ordinary life. No longer confused, no longer compelled to carry what was never yours, and no longer inclined to translate your existence into usefulness for anyone else.